Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
You mentioned the British Museum where you had this spring-summer show a few days ago. The title of the show, you were inspired by a book by Radclyffe Hall called The Well of Loneliness. It was a forbidden book. I mean, it was published, but then it had a lot of
backlash.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you choose it as the name of your collection. But in your collection, we noticed that you had dresses like you normally do. I mean, different kind, with your style, flowers, and the romantic feeling and all that. But there were suits that you did with Edward Sexton, Savile Row tailor.
Correct.
But you also now do menswear, right? I read some that you do menswear. So why did you want to use a Savile Row tailor? Can you describe a little bit this new collection of yours?
I was fascinated by the book, and particularly the idea of gender. And it describes very closely the relationship of two people, one, a woman who was renamed by her father as Stephen Gordon, who's a fictional character, and Mary Llewellyn, Mary, who's her greatest love. And there were kind of interesting parallels between both of these characters and Radclyffe Hall and Una Tunbridge, who was her real-life partner. They lived very outwardly and openly as a couple. And you can see images of them here. I found this middle image so kind of particularly inspiring. And you described the dresses in the show, and to me it was almost like this push and pull between Una and Radclyffe, the idea of the feminine countering the kind of the masculine. And there's a wonderful passage in the book of Stephen being fitted for a suit on Savile Row, and he's about to go meet, they are about to go meet an American woman that they've kind of fallen in love with, and which ends very badly. But there's this wonderful moment of her being outfitted for a suit, but a man's suit, and the pride she has in kind of being fitted for this suit and becoming who she felt was her true self. And I thought there was something very interesting about that, the idea of the female, the male, the push and the pull, and maybe a little bit of something that was quite in between, felt kind of quite interesting to me.
And so you went to see a friend in Savile Row?
Yes, and we collaborated, and it was wonderful to have that.
Because you're not able to design men's clothes. I mean, you rather use a proper men's tailor?
Well, what's interesting is, these tailored looks are things that we made in the studio. This one were made on Savile Row. It's not that we couldn't make them, but rather the sensibility and very technical, beautiful finish of it just being entirely hand-finished and hand-basted, and everything was just a different thing. It was a different handle, and it felt very interesting to kind of fit the jackets and the double-breasted jackets and how they fell on the female models, but really making them become quite masculine, actually, in the process. It was interesting.
And then it's interesting the contrast between this and the very feminine clothes with very light cloths.
Yes, it was Radclyffe to Una. It was the push and pull. And I find very interesting, like maybe the spectrum of gender and what one feels is their authentic self versus what one might biologically be born as. And I wonder if Radclyffe today would be considered non-binary or trans, and I found that very interesting, actually.
You like transformation anyway, right, in your own mind. I don't know why, but you like other women, like Tina Mondotti, for instance. She's one of your models.
Characters in my head, yes. Even Callas, I loved. The last fall collection was about Medea and a specific performance that Callas did at Scala in 1953 that I thought was so interesting.
There was a Pasolini movie, right?
That was a few years later, and the performance she did was done with an Italian artist named Fumici. I'm pronouncing it probably not correctly, but a very interesting man who did set design mostly, but he painted these almost quite crude outlines of Grecian kind of costume, and They were so interesting and crude almost.
Was it Piero Tosi? No.
No, it wasn't Piero Tosi, who I love. And I've never visited the studio in Rome.
La Sartoria Tirelli. You didn't visit that?
I need to visit because Visconti is my favorite. I love Visconti above everything. I mean, it's amazing. So I would love to. One day I'll go.
You are always inspired either by films or by books. I mean, I read that you were inspired by Susan Sontag.
Yes.
You know, the book on what is the title? The Volcano.
Lover.
Love story of Horace Nelson and
yes.
Emma Hamilton.
Yes.
But then you say, because people are dancing on the lip of a volcano.
Yes.
Right? This is a sentence of yours.
Yes. It was very interesting, particularly at that time, because that collection was designed during COVID. And we had that show in the middle of a forest, in the middle of really nowhere. And you had the trees lining the kind of runway, as it were, which kind of weirdly gave a great freedom because we didn't have to worry about an audience. There was no audience. You were allowed very few people on set. But there were parallels to that book. You know, that book describes great change before all of the revolutions that were to take place. And it was, you know, at that moment, that little moment that she describes is very, very, very interesting. I thought it was a fascinating book.
In a way, you're fascinated by that time and also by the fact that she's wearing jeans. You didn't use much, then you did something with it.
Yes, yes, exactly. And I thought there was something so wonderfully romantic about that particular book. I loved the idea of it. And it's one of my favorite books, actually. I love that book. I love that book and Modern Nature by Derek Jarman's my other favorite book.
Because you like books, right? You like very much books, and since
It's a problem, actually. If you see in this room, I have very little space. I'm running out.
I know what it means.
Yes.
To love books. But since young, you watch all the, for instance, the Merchant Ivory movies. You know, why?
My mother was English. My father was Turkish. And so my mother, in order to feel some kind of connection to where she was from, you know, the only kind of British television that was on.
You were living in Canada, right?
Exactly.
Where you were raised.
So you had PBS, the public broadcasting channel, and what you would watch is kind of Merchant Ivory movies. So I had this very false, idyllic idea of what the UK was. And of course it was something that I knew was false from a young age. My mum was from a very working class family in Birmingham, the eldest of three, and left when she was quite young, but virtually half of my family is in Birmingham, kind of like really in the same street where my mum grew up. It's funny, there was this kind of fantasy of a culture, of a country that never existed in a way.
Yeah, so you came to the Royal College.
Yes.
In England, right?
Yes.
Because at the time, Paris was the city of fashion, you know, before Milan. But you decided to come to London.
Well, at first I had a passport, which helped. So I was able to be here. It was, of course, post that time, but the time of John Galliano, McQueen, everyone was coming from London. Everything seemed to be beginning in London. I didn't go to St. Martin's, so I didn't apply to St. Martin's. I applied to the Royal College. David Hockney went to the Royal College. Ozzie Clarke went to the Royal College. There was a world about the Royal College that I was quite interested in. And I thought, maybe I'll apply. And I was able to get a scholarship from the British Council. They have a thing called the Chevening Scholarship, which is usually, it's an academic scholarship. They never give it to applied art students. But I was able to get a scholarship, and I was one of 10 in my class. And then I began. I began in 2001. And that was a very interesting time for me. It was, you know, you have to remember I was from Canada. I was from a very small college. And suddenly there was a lecture with Wolfgang Tillmans about photography, or maybe Hussein Chalayan giving a lecture, but in the architecture department. You had this whole world in front of you. And also what was so fascinating is, I mean, I think maybe I'm quite a nosy person, but you had printing studios, embroidery studios, you had millinery studios, weavers, you know, and still to my friends, my first friends when I moved to London are all friends I was at the Royal College with. So you had, you know, extraordinary weavers, embroiderers. The person who embroidered we collaborated together on my graduate collection. 23 years later, I hired her and she's working with me. I still work with the same person who makes millinery hats from when I was a student.
You're a very faithful man.
I'm very faithful, and
your roots.
including my husband, who I met when I was at the Royal College, who was studying architecture. And the first thing he said was, "One day I will design your first store."
And he did.
And he did.
Yes.
He did.
Where was your first store? In South Audley Street?
Exactly, in Mayfair, and it's still there.
And how many stores you have now?
2, soon to be 3.
Where's the third one going to be?
In Seoul.
In Seoul. So always in London.
Yes, and I'm hoping for New York very soon.
But you worked in New York. I mean, when you finished school, if I read well, you worked briefly for Vivienne Westwood, or you had something to do with her, and then you stayed in New York shortly and then came back to London.
So I worked, actually, Vivienne Westwood was in London, but when I was still on my BA, so I was doing like a stage, and it was amazing. I mean, it was extraordinary. I remember the first day I was in the atelier, and there was one person that was in charge of there was the head of the atelier, who was named Bridget, who was amazing, and who I still know. And she interviewed me and she took me on as an intern, which was amazing. Suddenly I was with Westwood. I loved Westwood. I mean, Westwood was, if you're an Anglophile, Westwood is like, those iconic collections of her that she did. And I worked in the atelier, and then I also worked very closely in the archives. I love the archives.
You like to go into libraries and archives.
I got to turn the clothes inside out. I understood how things were made, or tried to figure out how things were made. I would see corsets that were made by Mr. Pearl. You would see these collections that you knew so well from watching them on television. You could see how they were made. And it was very interesting, going back a little bit to growing up in Canada. Strangely, we had a lot of fashion on television. You had Tim Blanks on Fashion File, Jeannie Becker on Fashion Television. You had Elsa Clench on CNN. You had the French news, because you had Canal 5, so you watched the news from Paris. And in France, they report on haute couture. They report on the ready-to-wear shows, like it's, national news, unlike here in the UK, where they don't report on anything. It's like...
but fashion in France is...
taken seriously.
Very important, right?
Yes, which is a shame, because...
You were lucky, because being Canadian-French, you speak French, probably, You spoke French.
Yes.
Since a very small child, you loved women body, dresses, and you were drawing. Maybe because your twin sister, Sarah, who was very important in your life, she was your alter ego, I don't know.
I was fascinated by women, always from a very young age. Even, I remember my mother would have her friends over, how they sat, how they talked to each other, how they looked, what they were wearing, how they moved. I remember looking at my mother's makeup, my mother's dresses, things. I was forensically fascinated in things that were feminine. It was always a kind of, a forensic study. It was something that I found fascinating and also very, very powerful. I found that very interesting.
But when one is a designer, right? A clothes designer for women, and you have all these collections, every other season you have to produce something new. There still is a fil rouge in your collections. Because after all, do you really have to change everything, every collection, every summer? You became overnight famous. You didn't do all the curricula, you finish school, briefly go to America, come back, make your own business. And you still have it, it's yours, you don't depend from a large group or whatever, which I guess you're proud of, to be independent. How do you work? Do you have an ideal woman or an ideal type of clothes or some ideas that you repeat over and over?
As you say, I think there's the fil rouge, if we can call it that, is, I think, maybe a handwriting. I think it's a language that you have, and it's interesting. I can look at my latest collection and even my very first collection that I did when I was at the Royal College, and you can still see like a thread of something. I think I've always been very fascinated by the language of a femininity. And I think that language can be things that evoke a femininity, whether it's something as simple as a lace or a silhouette that is particularly feminine, or a flower is something that is often something I always go back to. I think what that signifies has always been something that's very, very interesting to me as a language. But I've always been interested in things that also don't necessarily go together, or a juxtaposition or a tension, I think. Between the feminine, there's always something else, or between something that is beautiful, there's always something else. There's something that's off. And I find this offness and this oddness something that is reoccurring and almost something I like to undo. I like the idea of things that don't quite go together. I also like the idea that maybe the clothes are part of some kind of narrative or story. I think otherwise they just become an act of clothing.
But you are a kind of designer. I don't want to offend you. It's just a kind of curiosity. There are designers, I don't know, like Armani, who since the beginning he thought about practical, the woman who works, and he makes a fashion that some other designers did things that you cannot really wear, that are spectacularly strange, no? I mean, I think of Lacroix, I think of the young Gautier, I think of Westwood sometimes, and so on and so forth. Where are you positioned? I mean, you want to make clothes that a woman can wear, or like we have seen the other night at the British Museum with all these big columns, you want to make a big show, and then the real clothes are simpler or whatever. I am trying to understand, what is your vision, of the woman? What kind of woman you want to dress?
I mean, for me as a designer, I think design in a way there's an element also of making a proposal, but also creating something that has a function as well. And I find it very interesting when you can explore ideas like Radclyffe, but also explore the idea of creating something that has a function. I don't necessarily know, or in a weird way care, if the end client understands the full story. I think there's almost a different step that happens when the collection is then taken apart and someone then goes into the boutique and tries something on. Your relationship changes. There's this one moment where someone puts something on and is zipped into a dress, their shoulders go back, and they either feel like a beautiful version of themselves or someone else, or they feel terrible. It's a very visceral, immediate thing. And that's such a powerful, amazing thing. And I think if you do something well, that idea of putting something on someone that they absolutely know they must have, that idea of desire, is amazing. There's nothing more exciting than seeing someone wear something that you've designed. But I believe in order to get to that step, to explore ideas that are some abstract, some meaningful, there's different stories and different characters that carry different nuances and weights, but all of those things lead you ultimately to the same place, to that moment in that room where someone is trying on something.
But the women who try, with all the respect, that if you resemble to the ones who were showing, you have these very tall and thin models who are very young, and you probably sell most of your clothes to other kind of women.
Maybe if something is resolved, actually it could look so beautiful and chic on someone who is older, younger, bigger, smaller. I think if something is resolved, of course, within parameters, it can work on lots of different people. And in a way, maybe that's how I've maintained my independence. I've always been able to create, hopefully, things that people wear.
We say fashion, right? Fashion normally is short, because if it's fashion, it cannot be forever, right? So how can one keep being in fashion for so many years? Since the beginning. What is your secret? Because you are independent, which is not the case of many. And you keep on going, and you're successful, in the world of big corporations. Or many of your colleagues work for, I don't know, they work for Dior or for Chanel, something else. You have your own name.
Well, that's a very good question. I think I've always been very curious, and I've always wanted to be good. I've always wanted to do good work. And I've always been very interested in her and who she is. I like the idea of who she is and what's happening to her in her life, however abstract that could be in terms of something to apply to a garment. But to answer the question, the first part of your question about how transient fashion is, of course, fashion is very, very transient. But I find it kind of very interesting if I see someone wearing something of mine that they bought 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 15 years ago. I think there's something very interesting about looking back at things and re-wearing them. I think recontextualizing things. And when you see someone wearing something that you've designed that might be almost 20 years old, but they're wearing it in their own, it's absorbed into their life. They wear it in their own way. I find that kind of really wonderful. So as transient as we talk about fashion, of course it is transient. And there's a big output. You are producing constantly. You're designing one collection, showing one while designing the next one. You're producing the collection that you showed last year while you're about to show the next collection. So you're on this kind of hamster wheel of creation.
In other words, you just showed spring and summer and you're preparing winter, right?
Yes, and we're shipping, fall-winter is now in the stores and I'm designing for the fall-winter show in February. So you have often kind of almost 4 collections in rotation at the same time.
But you like to be in your studio, which you call your portable paradise, right? To be with your people in the studio.
I love being in the studio. I love everyone I work with. We spend so much time together, and I work with an extraordinary, amazing team. I also like the blank page. Where do we go next? And what's the next story to tell? It's almost like making a film. What's the next film? And I find that really thrilling and terrifying. But
Terrifying.
I really find it very interesting, actually.
Keep talent is difficult. You talked about Orkney, which means that you are interested in art. Artists copy each other over the years, or they have the same subject that they realize in a different way. Since a long time, Giuditta e Oloferne, everybody did this, David and Goliath. You have seen that repeatedly done by different artists. So maybe what has impressed me was that you had these large gowns.
The green, yes,
which somehow remind me the new look of Dior. But what has really impressed me, or I watched it, were the pockets. It's kind of large pockets
that create the shape. Yes,
create the shape. So, am I right? Am I wrong? I don't know.
There was something very interesting about taking this silhouette and then, what you usually have start at the waist, dropping it down and having it very exaggerated. And so within it, you have this wonderful line of the body, and it's corseted, that goes very fitted on the hip. And then you had this space for the pockets, which was wonderful.
So these are real pockets?
They're real pockets, but it's like taking the silhouette and dropping it. At that moment, we were thinking about the year 1928, but the idea of okay, how do we twist this idea of something that is very fitted, but then you just stretch it down. And it felt very kind of interesting and kind of quite bizarre, actually, that the volume started a bit low and it created this very elegant shape. And you read the hip, which was, I thought, so kind of quite beautiful, actually. And then the dress is completely sheer, mounted on a corset, but done in a way that you read like an X-ray, the entire, how it's been put together. There's not really any secrets.
Large thing, reminds also paintings like the Meninas.
Yes, wonderful.
Or something
wonderful.
Like that, right?
Beautiful. And even it's a panier skirt, it could be Velasquez, it could be Versailles, it could be the 1940s.
Right.
But in my mind, weirdly, it was this idea of this kind of slight odd 20s volume. It was like this
I
odd...
had the feeling that
odd.
It was also comfy.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That are two pockets like this.
Yes.
But you...
And casual. I think
right.
everything that was formal this season, I felt very callous. Everything was quite tense. It's wrapped, it's protected. It's this gesture over the shoulder, When you're a boy, when you put on your trousers, when you have your pockets, when you're uncomfortable, you put your hands in your pockets.
That's right.
And
That's
you
what
slouch.
I noticed.
And there's something very interesting that happens to your posture when you put your hands in your pocket. Your back, you round your spine, you relax.
We'll see if this model is successful, more than others.
Who knows? It might be a disaster.
Sometimes you had disasters.
Many.
And how you react in front of a disaster.
You learn. There's so many moving parts in creating a collection and in our world, the reaction to things, some things that resonate, some things that don't. So maybe it's about how you react to them. That's the most important thing.
But you are shy, right? Because you didn't appear after the collection. Sometimes the designer comes out with all the models, you don't come out.
I was very quick. I'm quite shy in that situation.
You are shy.
I find that quite overwhelming, actually. You've just shown everything, and I think I quite like to come back and just be...
And you have a number of faithful Erdem followers, people who really expect the new collection. You always buy your things, or it's difficult to know who is going to...
Yes, I have clients, yes. And clients where we often make bespoke things. Yes.
You make wedding clothes or, wedding dress.
Yes. What people might not know is that most of my private clients come for things like tailoring or very specific dresses or trousers and things that I make every season where I create a little wardrobe or things that they need. But often they're, of course, lots of special things like wedding dresses and kind of dresses for kind of special, important events. But a lot of things that are quite for every day.
What about the accessories, the shoes, the bags, the jewelry, whatever?
Yes.
I mean, you had very odd shoes.
Very odd shoes. They were all handmade in England with this kind of strange tassels. But they were Radclyffe. So, you had the man's shoe, even with the most delicate little 20s slip dress. And the bags, it's the first season I did a bag. I've never done a bag before, actually. So you came on a special show.
The shoes and the bags are yours?
Yes.
You design them, you create them?
Yes.
And you like it?
Very much, because it's her world. When Philip was designing the space for the store, he was figuring out, in a way, what's the carpet that she would stand on. How would the changing room feel like in her? How would her cupboard feel? How would her closet feel? Or how would her apartment feel like? How would her home feel like? Who is she? And I think those forensic questions, what's the bag that she would hold? How would she hold it? The gesture of how she walks. Does she hold it like this? Does she hold it like this? Does she hold it under her arm? Is she shy? Is she confident? What is she? She's so many different things. So I think in a way to create these other aspects.
But you created also the men's shoes?
Yes.
They're not church.
No.
They are made by you.
No, but I love churches. They're very good.
So that's interesting to put together masculine shoes and very feminine clothes. And nowadays they say that luxury brands are over, that people are fed up with big famous names who are too expensive. And you also had an experience of H&M, You work for something very different,
Yes.
What do you think is the future? With all respect to Kat, you're quite small and independent, vis-a-vis the big groups. And do you think there is a crisis? And do you think the world of fashion will change?
That's a very good question. You could argue, there's many crises happening in the world. There's war happening. There's economic crisis. Of course, there's crisis. But within the fashion industry, I think, like any industry, it evolves. It is different to when I started. It'll be different in 20 years. It'll be different in 10 years. When I started, you didn't even have online shopping. It didn't exist. So like anything, I think it evolves. Is that evolution a reflection of crisis? No, I think people evolve and adapt. I wonder if there is something about size and how big these groups are. It's an ongoing conversation, but I don't know. I find it quite an interesting time, actually. I think it's a very interesting time to be doing this. I find it really kind of.
And you create the shows by yourself. I mean,
yes.
And you decide we'll do it in this place and this way.
Yes, the flower that sits on your chair, the booklet, the color of that ribbon, exactly what words are said here, everything. But and going back to the collaboration, I did that in 2017, a very long time ago, and it was an interesting exercise. I think there was something very interesting about creating something that many people could access. And also suddenly you were available in 70 countries around the world, that those opportunities to be able to show what you do to so many different people are rare. It was an interesting experience.
And you stopped.
When you're a guest designer, they invite you for one season, so it's quite an interesting...
You would like to do other seasons in that kind of world? I mean, there are many now, this from Uniqlo to Zara.
I think it's interesting when you're given an opportunity to move outside of your comfort zone. I collaborated with the Royal Ballet a few years ago, designing costumes for a piece called Corybantic Games, which is a modern piece with the choreographer Christopher Wheeldon. And that, for example, was also something that very much coming out of my comfort zone, and working with a choreographer who was creating the piece as I was designing the costumes. And the brief was, I don't want color, I don't want any textural anything. It was very interesting. He really wanted to strip everything away. And so to kind of get into his head and to figure out how to create these costumes was such an interesting process. It was for the Leonard Bernstein centenary, and the piece of music was written in the 1950s. And so it was called Corybantic Games, the title of the work. And the Corybantics were a group of young Greek youths. And so I started to look at Grecian kind of athletic kind of strapping that often featured on Grecian statues, and also 1950s underwear, corsets, girdles, Y-fronts, men's costumes, women's costumes, and looking at how your undergarments from the 1950s, which are quite specific, and mixing the two. It was so interesting to work at the Opera House because, again, to have the opportunity to design something that's actually being created at the same time as it's being designed is very interesting. I loved it.
I read that you also have men's clothes, no? Is it true?
I started in a very small way, a very small men's collection, which I have paused because we did it during COVID and it was...
Not going so well.
It was a COVID casualty, sadly.
But you like to dress women more than men, anyway.
I like to dress both. I would like to revisit menswear and do it properly when I'm ready.
With Savile Row?
With pleasure, with Savile Row, always Savile Row.
But do you think people were more elegant in the past, or they are equally elegant today, or elegance changes with design, with the way of living and so on?
I mean, I suppose the right answer would be something like people are elegant in a different way now than they are in the past. But I think it's hard to compete with the 1930s, when I think people really, truly looked so beautifully elegant. I mean...
And you think they will ever come back?
I also think there's something about the idea of dressing, you know, people dressed for dinner.
There are no more dressing codes, or very little.
Yes.
You think it's a pity, or...?
It's not a pity, because I think also those codes can kind of be quite oppressive, actually. So I think, you know, an elegance is something also that's in how someone moves, how they talk, how they look. You really do notice when someone's elegant.
But this is like someone who is handsome or beautiful. Obviously, beauty is something you cannot resist watching, if there is, you know. And that can be for a woman, a landscape, a painting or something, a house. But nowadays, I mean, people who are not, you know, they're all practicing sports. They all have bottles, plastic bottles of water. They love sport clothes, you know, gym clothes. Before it was different. You had codes. You played tennis dressed in white.
Yes.
Or you were going to a certain hotel with a suit or
yes.
with a long dress and so on and so forth. Now all this is finished.
Do you miss the codes?
I don't, because I still follow it. But there's no more this idea of wardrobe that you have to have a dinner jacket, a sport jacket, a blue suit, a grey suit, blah, blah, blah. There's no more this kind of education, as well as you don't change the colors of the shirts, you don't repair your shoes. It's a different world. But this probably is not the world of women's fashion.
It's interesting. I think I'm really going off piece, but I have to go to a dinner this evening, and the dress code was formal, whatever formal means. And I find that such formal, it's formal black tie, not quite black tie, because if it was black tie, they would say black tie. Or do you take formal as black tie?
I mean, in my way of dressing, I would wear a navy blue suit.
Exactly, a dark suit.
Or a pink shirt, and then eventually a tie or not tie, it depends.
So I opted for a navy blue suit, Savile Row, but with sweater and with a kind of quite casual shoe. But it's funny, I think codes are kind of quite vague nowadays. But I remember when I first told my father I wanted to become a fashion designer, and it was I had to announce it. It was a thing because I had been accepted into university and to study different things. And I was studying liberal arts, so classics, before I decided to go into fashion. And so maybe the thoughts were I'd go into law or something different than fashion. But when I first told my father about fashion, he reacted in a very positive way. And I think in Turkey, where he was from, Eastern Turkey in Antakya, you always kind of viewed fashion, you would have someone who would make shoes, you would have someone who would make suits, you would go to the shirt person for your shirts, etc. It was a vocation, a skill. And he found it kind of quite exciting, actually. Whereas I think my mother maybe associated it more with the notions of it's a very difficult industry. Often people are quite difficult within the industry, She associated it with all the negative ideas that you might associate with the industry.
No, but I mean, fashion became bloomed and people love fashion, it just has changed. So once upon a time you want to have Levi's, blue jeans, 501, and that's all. And now you pay hundreds of dollars or pounds of jeans with holes because they are fashionable. When I was young, we liked to use our one pair of jeans, until we were very old, because we were very proud of
the
age of the jeans. Now you buy them broken for 10 times more than the ones who are new. So it's a different concept. I don't criticize, it's just different. When I see your clothes, and women are still dressed sometimes very beautifully.
Yes, I still believe that there is that idea of creating something that makes you feel completely like
you have a new challenge? You have something you hope?
Yes. I mean, for me, every collection is a challenge. So it's figuring out what's going to happen to her next is the biggest challenge. I think another challenge, what I'm very excited about is, like on South Audley Street, how, you can enter the world physically when you enter the store. I think the idea of having more spaces around the world where you can enter the world and you understand the world is very important. I think now, as things change, particularly within department stores and wholesale, to have your own connection to the client.
But I like the idea that you are you, all the people are Armani, Prada, Chanel, you are Erdem.
Yes.
You are like Coco, Giorgio, Miuccia, as your own label, so which is quite special in a way, right?
No, it's wonderful. It feels very...
So people are obliged to call you with your name, even if you don't know them.
Exactly. But it's, it's strange. Next, in 2026 will be my 20-year anniversary since I made that first collection that I sold to Barney's. That's how I really, truly began. It wasn't overnight at all. It really took time. It took a very long time to get to...
Not so long.
But it was, I was very fortunate to work with Barney's, and that suddenly I was in a very important store in New York, in Beverly Hills. And from there, even though I was working in a very, very small studio in East London on Mare Street, I was seen. People could see my clothes, and from there, it just grew little by little. But there's something interesting. You can't help but look backwards when you're about to turn 20. It also kind of just feels like the beginning. I don't feel like it's 20 years at all. I just feel like it's like 5 minutes.
Because you did what you liked.
Yes.
Can we conclude saying that you followed your dream?
Completely.
And you made your dream become a reality?
Completely. And sometimes it actually comes true. You know, it's very strange.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alain Elkann interviews.